So think about the marketing context. Think about what the competition are going to do. Think about what's going to happen in the media marketplace. And think about media prices, because there may be some opportunities here. First, think about the competition. Less competition may make this a cheap time to gain market share, because in many categories, long-term market share is driven by advertising share of voice, not absolute spend. So if cash-strapped competitors are cutting their budgets, this is a cheap time to buy share of voice and so gain market share. You may even be able to cut your spend and still grow if you cut less than your competitors do. Secondly, think about the media marketplace, because falling media prices may make this even cheaper. When times are tough, demand for ad media shrinks, but supply, measured in eyeballs, is much less elastic for most media. There are some exceptions, for example, like cinema. But in general, what we see is people are watching more TV, listening to more radio, using social media more, and reading more online news. So there are more ways of reaching people with those media. With less money chasing more eyeballs, cost per view plunges. So if a firm has the cash and the courage to maintain higher spend than its competitors, a downturn is a great media buying opportunity, particularly for firms whose sales remain fairly resilient throughout the recession. As I keep saying, lockdown is as much a crisis of supply as demand. People still want to go to shops and restaurants, but they can't. When lockdown is eased, availability will increase again. So how should firms respond? There's no definitive research on this, but I think there's a useful analogy with startups and other product launches. When a firm or a product first launches, sales tend to rise exponentially at first due to a combination of increased availability and herd behaviour. There's a famous mathematical model that describes this pattern of growth. As lockdown is eased, we can expect the same pattern of growth. People will be slow to venture out at first. A few hardy souls at first, then their friends will follow them until things get back to whatever the new normal is. So as you start back up, maybe you should think like a startup. Imagine you're launching your business from scratch, where you have to build supply and demand in tandem. Advertising can help that process in two ways. First, ads can accelerate growth as lockdown is eased. Second, ads can help firms reach a higher normal level of sales once all this is over. Our analysis of the IPA data bank shows that new products and businesses are unusually responsive to advertising. And the same may be true for products and services that are emerging from lockdown. It may only take a little nudge to get people rushing back to buy your brand. So, if your supply will only increase slowly, keep ad spend modest at first. Otherwise, you risk being overwhelmed with demand that you can't fulfill. Then increase spend as capacity improves. But if your supply can be turned back on quickly, you may want to advertise heavily to shift units straight away. Think about how fast your business can bring supply back to normal. Now, if this analogy holds, then it may tell us something about how to allocate budgets as we shift from lockdown to recovery. As I said, firms that face supply restrictions right now should probably keep spends low. And they should probably focus mainly on a little bit of emotional brand building to raise morale and remind people that they're there, and a limited amount of highly targeted activation, which is functional and helps people to navigate their way through the crisis or sells directly. But as supply restrictions are lifted, as lockdown is lifted, then they need to think like startups. And we know that startups in their early years need a more activation heavy mix. The primary job is to tell people that you're there and to get the product out there, to fill the supply pipeline. So as lockdown is lifted, those firms that had suffered supply restrictions before should begin to dial up the activation part of the budget. Then, as things begin to get back to normal, they need to tilt towards brand, because that's again what we see. Startups, new products, as they mature, need to tilt from activation towards brand. So as the recovery proceeds, those firms should dial up the brand part of the budget until they get back to the classic 60-40 ratio, 60% brand building, 40% activation. So it's just a hypothesis, but it seems intuitively plausible. Now, that's the situation for firms that face supply restrictions, but of course other brands are in a very different situation. If you're selling a staple food that's freely available at the moment in the supermarkets, then you should actually probably take advantage of low media prices, of perhaps low competitive spend. You should go heavy with brand building, buy share of voice in order to gain long-term market share, exploit the buying opportunity of the recession. So those products and companies that don't face supply restrictions will need quite a different brand activation mix, much more brand heavy right now, and much higher spends right now. So I hope it's clear that different firms need to adopt quite different strategies as they move from lockdown to recovery. Some firms need to cut their spend, keep their powder dry until supply restrictions are eased, and then slowly tilt back from activation to brand. Others can afford to spend heavily now and take advantage of cheap media to buy high share of voice and hence gain long-term market share. Which way you jump depends on the precise set of circumstances facing your brand. So you need to ask yourself some questions. What are my supply constraints and how will they evolve over the next 2 years? Given the constraints on my business, including constraints on cash flow, what can I do right now to help people through the crisis? How can I help the war effort, as I put it earlier on? And how will the crisis affect demand for my products and services over the short, medium and long term? Given all that, how can I use all 4 marketing Ps to keep supply and demand in sync over the next couple of years? Should I change the mix of products and services that I offer? Can I find new ways of distributing them? How should I manage my prices, bearing in mind that price signals things about my company, about my reputation, about my brand image? How will my competitors behave? Is this a good time to gain market share at their expense? What will happen to the prices of advertising and other marketing inputs? Is this a good buying opportunity? Does cash flow force me to cut ad spend, or can I use cheap media now to buy share of voice and hence market share? Do supply constraints mean I should turn advertising back on slowly through the recovery, or should I use the full force of advertising to restore demand quickly back to its former level or even higher? There are no simplistic answers to these questions, but I hope this presentation has given you a framework for thinking about the problem. Thank you.